Okay. This is show and tell. There are two videos that I would recommend. In past seminars, we've actually shown them, but one in particular is way too long. So the one is on the Common Core. And how many of you are in states that are still stuck with the...
I think we are.
Of course, New York is getting its way out of it.
We modified Common Core to make it more like our own regions, but it still happens.
You know, it's interesting in a lot of these social issues, and we even see it in the church, the far right and the far left often meet on something, but for very different reasons. So in the church, for example, the far right doesn't like concelebration, nor does the far left. The far right doesn't like it because it's not individual celebrations of Mass. The far left doesn't like it because it creates, quote, male-dominated liturgy. But they're united in that issue. Common Core has had the same reaction. Conservative Americans have disliked it for a variety of reasons. First of all, because it's just bad pedagogy. But the left doesn't like it, particularly the teacher unions, because of the standardized testing. And now, I like the idea of standardized testing, and you hear teachers say, "Oh, I'm doing so much more than." Well, no. Let's start with what you're being paid to do, you know. And I'm a great believer in merit pay, actually, you know, which is, you know, for example, if a kid goes into your class, fourth grade class, reading at the second grade level, and by the end of the year he's at fourth or fifth grade level, I think you get a bonus. Conversely, you know, if they're not doing what they should be doing or not achieving what they should be, and these are measurable outcomes. At any rate, this goes to the core of the problem with the Common Core. And as I said, I think it's very worthwhile. This other one, it's a rather protracted, it's almost 2 hours, called Waiting for Superman. And it's about the disaster of the government schools, particularly in suburbia. Now, one of the arguments we've heard for years is, granted, the government schools in the inner city are terrible. They're a disaster, they're bad education, it's unsafe, and all the rest of it. But in suburbia, it's all wonderful. Well, this puts the lie to it. Now, the only thing that really irks me about this, the producer talks about alternatives to the government schools in suburbia, talks about private schools and so forth, and charter schools, but not a word about Catholic schools, as though we don't. So I don't know if he's got some kind of an issue with the church or what, but it's bizarre that you would not talk about the largest provider of alternatives. But that having been said, it is worthwhile. And particularly for priests to know this, because the biggest objection that pastors of suburban parishes get is the local public school is wonderful, all right? You know, they have wonderful athletic facilities, and the kids are all getting A's, and you know, all the rest of the business. But and this puts the lie to that. It documents it very, very well. I mentioned to you the other day about the science curriculum, and here's the book that I was. Now, by the way, please make sure I get all of these back, because I know priests have these strange ideas about corporation souls, so property can just move to a different location. But this is by Professor Christopher Baglow that I mentioned the other day, who teaches at Notre Dame Seminary in New Orleans. And it's called Faith, Science, and Reason, Theology on the Cutting Edge. And it is a beautiful book, first of all. I mean, just a very appealing book. And 1, 2, 3 years ago, I think it was, he sponsored a workshop in New Orleans in August, you can imagine, just walking from one building to the other in the New Orleans humidity. We were absolutely drenched. But he sponsored a workshop for Catholic high schools, and it was a religion teacher and a science teacher had to come from the same school. And it was a week-long conversation about the interfacing of faith and reason, religion and science, and so forth. And these were all scholarships for these teachers to attend. But the deal was, in order to qualify, you had to then produce a program for your high school that would be enacted the following year. And it was really very, very fine. We had, I think it was limited to 50 teachers, so 25 high schools. And but in some sense, this book is the outgrowth of it. So part one, a friendly reunion, the relationship between natural science and supernatural faith. This is a point too, I think, that needs to be made. Sometimes you hear people say, faith means believing without seeing. That's not what faith is. Faith is not seeing. Faith is seeing according to a different perspective, or seeing with corrective lenses. Right? I always say, my natural sight, I see blur. I put the glasses on, boom, and I have perfect vision. Right? And faith does the same thing for us. Our natural sight is obscured because of the effects of original sin. The grace of baptism and the life of the sacraments of the church and so forth give us the corrective lenses to see reality correctly. So natural science, supernatural faith. Chapter 1, faith and science at the crossroads of nature and spirit. 2, science and the Christian faith, renewing an old relationship. And see, that's the point he makes, is that the historic relationship between the church and science is very, very positive. 3, the Big Bang about creation. Is Scripture anti-science? And this is another problem that we Catholics face in regard to society at large. Because we're considered to be, quote, conservative, we get lumped in with the fundamentalists on creationism and all that stuff, which is, never an issue, been an issue for us, 4, patroness of persecutor, the Catholic Church and scientific discovery. ABC Infinity, learning to read the story of the universe, and a whole section about Galileo and all the mythology that's associated with that. Part 2, God and science, the credibility of the creator. The biggest question, has science disproved God? The twist in the tale, modern science versus scientific atheism. Going deeper than Darwin, faith in the origins of living things. Part 3, in his image, human personhood and modern science. The human person from the divine perspective. Scientific challenges to human dignity and personhood. The emergence of the image, modern science and the origins of humanity. Miracles, signs and wonders at the crossroads of faith and science. Something about miracles too. Some years ago, I got a call from PBS. They were doing a special on miracles. And someone gave my name, and the program director wanted to do a kind of a pre-interview with me. And she said, well, so what's the Catholic attitude toward miracles and apparitions? And I said, well, the church's presumption is that the person is either a fraud or a nut. And she said, what? And I said, well, yeah, prove it. The church doesn't take, I said, there are thousands and thousands of assertions of these miraculous things, and an infinitesimal number of them ever get approved. And she said, are you really a Catholic priest? Because, of course, the presumption is that we're all gullible and stupid, and that every time you hear about, Mary appearing on a tree trunk somewhere, everybody is excited about it, and and so he does a very, very good job here about talking about miracles.
Excuse me, did you say this is it a textbook for high school, or could
well,
school?
I think junior high it would work fine. Right?
You mean for junior high students?
Yes. Yeah. I think a 7th grader in a Catholic school could read it. And I think there's also a guide that goes with it. I mentioned this book the other day, and I couldn't remember the author. It's Father Stephen O'Brien, Mixed Messages, What Bishops and Priests Say About Catholic Schools. And it was the point that I made that you know, at an official level, everybody says how wonderful this is, and at a practical level, you know, they're closing institutions every other week. Catholic high schools facing the new realities. Father James Heft, who had been the president of the University of Dayton, I don't know what he's doing at the moment, but facing new realities. And it's interesting for example, in the Rockville Center Diocese, Long Island, the then Bishop, Bill Murphy, said, our high schools are full. But, for example, they have 4 of their high schools have almost 3,000 kids each. Some of the smaller girls' schools would have, 200 or 300 kids. But, for example, Chaminade High School has, I think, 2,700 boys. And their freshman class is 400 some kids, 600 kids. And they have close to 2,000 applicants for the place. But anyway, Bishop Murphy was making the point that the high schools are full, but the grammar schools are struggling. And he attributed it to people trying to make a decision who are financially strapped. Do I send them to grade school, or do I send them to high school? And of course, it's an unreal comparison, because certainly, having been in high school work for years, I can tell you how difficult it is to assimilate a kid into a Catholic high school who has not been in a Catholic grade school. The whole question about discipline, respect for teachers, study habits, and just what you learn. And the high school that I had out in Staten Island, I had 72% of my freshmen came from public junior highs. It was torture. I mean, for them and for us. Right? At any rate, Father Heft has, I think, a good analysis of the high school situation. Conditions for success, historical developments, American culture and religion. And see, I think that's something too. Sometimes you hear people say, oh, the church involved in all this sociology. We have to worry about sociology. We do, right? A sociological survey is very valuable. Not that we say, 90% of Catholics believe that birth control is okay. It's not okay because 90% say it, but we need to know that 90% think that, and so that we know how to respond to the situation. The mission, moral and religious formation, leadership, theological sources and moral sources, students today, descriptions. So who are the clients? Who's coming? And perhaps much more than the students is the parents, right? I always used to say my favorite day of the school year was the first parent-teacher conference, because once you met the parents, you then understood everything about the kids, right? Or you'd send a girl home for a dress code violation, and my policy was you had to bring mommy back in a half hour, and mommy would come back dressed more immodestly than the daughter. And I'd say, now you go home, right? Because you're not coming into our school looking like this. New models and more money. The future of Catholic high schools, and then epilogue, post-deferential parents. And here's the point too, huh? When most of us were growing up, and if you went home and said, the teacher said, gave me detention, your mother would say, why? What did you do? Now, it's not even why, what did you do? It's let's go to that school and make sure we deal with her, right? The whole thing is backwards. Right? The inmates are running the asylum. This is a classic, and you can see it's been well used. It was by Father Andrew Greeley and 2 of his sociological colleagues, William McCready and Kathleen McCourt, Catholic Schools in a Declining Church. I think this was probably written in 68 or something. No, I'm sorry, 76. It's interesting, Greeley was a good sociologist. As I said, whatever you think about his porno novels, that's another story. But his sociology was spot on. And in the immediate post-conciliar period, the bishops relied on him a great deal he was at the University of Chicago, National Opinion Research Center, which was doing phenomenal work. And they commissioned him to do 2 major studies. and they already had their agenda, as bishops usually do when they have a survey, they already have in mind what they're going to do before the survey is taken. And but the Bishops' Conference commissioned him to do a survey on Catholic schools and another survey on celibacy. And on the Catholic school front, they expected him to say that the day was over, close the doors, and sell the property as quick as possible. And this is the survey, which says exactly the opposite. And then on the celibacy front, he said his survey revealed that the average priest is sexually immature. And the bishop said yes, and then he went on to say, but so is every American male. And the counter, the foil to it was, what is the sexual maturity levels of married men, all right? And so the two surveys that he did for them, they didn't like the results they got. And that was the end of Greeley's career with the Bishops' Conference. And then this is another classic, The Catholic School, Its Roots, Identity, and Future, by Father Harold Buteau, who taught at Catholic U for decades. It gives philosophy of Catholic education, the difference between education and schooling, why some people are against Catholic schools, why people are in favor of them, the goals of Catholic education, religion and values of the curriculum. By the way, this usually is not an issue at the elementary level, but at the high school level, what you call the course. And when I do these high school identity assessments, I always encourage, if they're calling the class theology, I say, no, it should be called religion. And why? Theology is an academic discipline. An atheist, Thomas Aquinas says, of course, that a real theologian has to be a believer, but Pace Thomas. But an atheist can take a theology class and regurgitate answers and get an A. Religion, religare in Latin, means to bind back. And so it's a relationship between, in this instance, the student and God and the student and church. And so when we're talking about a religion class, it's not simply a matter of knowing the theology. That's the first step. But then integrating that into one's life. I think that's the mistake that was often made in a lot of high schools, was we have this, and we want to sound more serious. So it sounded like biology, sociology, theology, right? But I think it's a linguistic mistake. Family and church, partners in education, the other partner, the state. What Catholic schools have to deal with: atmosphere, teachers, students, and conclusions and applications. I think he went to God a year or so ago. And this is a series, some of you may have seen it, it's had a few different editions. Theology of the Body for Teens, Discovering God's Plan for Love and Life. This is the middle school edition. It is superb. And it says just enough. It doesn't cross the border into prurient interests and so forth. But as I said in my overlong homily this morning, that it gives kids a rationale for maintaining chastity, and it gives a good psychology of it, and it's firmly grounded in the theology of the church. This is by three educational theorists, Anthony Brick, Valerie Lee, and Peter Holland, Catholic Schools and the Common Good. And this is from Harvard Press, by the way. It's interesting how some of these rather way out universities have decent presses. So this is the context for Catholic schools, institutional analysis, diversity among Catholic schools, effects and implications. And some of these materials, I think, ought to be at least in a faculty room or a resource shelf. It's not that everyone has to read these books cover to cover, but it certainly ought to be there so that, if the principal or you are called upon to make a presentation to the faculty for something, you don't have to start scrambling everywhere to get the stuff. This is a book by Monsignor Luigi Giussani, the founder of Communion and Liberation, Comunione e Liberazione, which is probably the only thing that keeps the Church in Italy from falling off into the Mediterranean. Giussani was a priest of Milan, and if memory serves, he was ordained about 1953, and his first assignment as a priest was teaching religion in one of the high schools of the archdiocese. And he says his first couple of weeks in the classroom, now remember this is 1953, that he was teaching the doctrine of the church in a period that ostensibly was well connected to the tradition. And he said, but he looked out at the boys' faces and he said they were uncomprehending and uninterested. And he said, that's when I began to understand we had to change our method of catechesis. And he said, it's not simply, and of course, we heard Benedict say this repeatedly, that the church is not simply a list of rules or doctrines, but it's a relationship with a person. And that was the source for Giussani beginning the Communion and Liberation movement. And so he always talks about encounter and personal and friend and so forth. And this book was first obviously published in Italian, Il Rischio Educativo, and the CL translated this into English, The Risk of Education. It's a wonderful book. It's a terrible translation. It's very wooden. But with that aside, it really is The Risk of Education, Discovering Our Ultimate Identity, and Dynamics and Factors of the Educational Event. That's another code word in Communion and Liberation, event. Crisis and Dialogue, The Structure of Experience, Education, Response, and Communication, The Ideal and the Life of Communion, The Conditions for a Family Education, and the Educational Process and Freedom. And he's talking about, obviously, Christian freedom. And Communion and Liberation, an interesting movement. Do you have them in Boston? And New York has a group of them. It doesn't seem to have caught on here the way it has in some places. Italy, as I say, it's the only game in town for the most part. They're faithful Catholics, they're young, and they're very engaged on the political front. And of course, they would be one of the ones condemned by Spadaro in Civiltà Cattolica 2 weeks ago. But their philosophy of life, the philosophy of education, is really, really superb. And Ratzinger says in one of his autobiographical interviews that Communion and Liberation saved his vocation as a priest. And in fact, the women who lived with him are members of the group called Memores Domini, which is the celibate contingent of the Communion and Liberation movement. And it was one of those women that was killed in a car accident a couple of years when he was still Pope. I think he was still Pope. And but the book is very, very worthwhile, independent of the bad translation. This is what schools ban and why. And you always hear about, the far right is always censoring things. Well, some of them would like to censor more, but they don't. I can't. But no one ever talks about censorship on the left, right? And the censorship there is every bit as real and very much more effective because they have all kinds of power at their disposal. And I remember, I think it was back in the 80s when Phyllis Schlafly, God rest her, just went to the kingdom, a couple of months ago. But she had written a very anti-feminist book, The Bad Feminism. And my mother went to the local public library and said, "Sister, do you remember the name of that book?" The Schlafly book?
I just heard her speak at Christmas time.
Yeah,
At St. Patrick's. I don't.
At any rate, whatever the book was, it was a bestseller. And my mother went to the local public library and said, "Do you have Mrs. Schlafly's book?" No, we don't. And my mother said, "Well, have you ordered it?" No. And my mother said, "Why would that be?" Well, my mother said, "It's bestseller, New York Times bestseller list for already 3 months." And, well, we have limited resources. And so there are thousands of books that are printed all the time, and we just can't buy them all. And my mother said, "Well, I want this one." And I think a lot of other women in Ocean County would like to read this. Well, and my mother said, "Well, let me tell you, if you don't order it, I'm going to stand outside the library with a petition drive, and I'm going to embarrass you into buying the book." All right. My mother could have been that widow in the parable. And at any rate, this book makes the point that there's all kinds of subtle censorship that goes on. What you can say, what you can't say. And now, of course, for all the language manipulation. And we have to, and this is another point to bring to the attention of teachers. Linguistic engineering is the first step to social engineering. In Mussolini's Italy, he thought it was very important, one of his goals was to make modern Italy a reincarnated form of Rome at its peak, ancient Rome. And he wanted to be virile and all the rest of it. And so there were things about the Italian language, for example, that he didn't like because they came out as too soft. And so, for example, the formal U in Italian is lei, L-E-I, which also is the pronoun for she. And so Mussolini insisted that it was not permissible any longer to use lei as the formal address. You had to use voi. And to use one or the other was to vote for or against his form of government. As it became the equivalent of Heil Hitler. It was an Italian version of Heil Hitler. And we see that in our society, where you have to, it drives me wild when I see even Catholic textbooks going for BCE, all right, and CE. Well, first of all, it's just stupid. What makes it the common era? Right? It's Christ, right? No matter how you slice the cake, it's Christ, right? And so be very careful about that whole business of language. The other is, there's a very, very fine co-institutional high school in the Archdiocese of Detroit. And they have, you know what co-institutional is? It's boys and girls on the same campus, but separate facilities. And so I think maybe K to 3, it's co-ed. And then at 4 to 12, they have separate classes. And the school is very, very good. It's very traditional and excellent academics. But I noticed on their publicity brochure, it said, we have single gender classes from 4th grade forward. And I said to the assistant headmistress, I said, gender is not what you think it means. She said, well, it just means we have male and female. I said, no. I said, gender is a code word, and gender is a grammatical construct. The biological word is sex, and it's either male or female. Gender is an arbitrary external imposition on sexuality. So, for example, in grammar, we say, in the Romance languages, there's no neuter. You have masculine and feminine. And so, for example, in all of the Romance languages and in Latin, the word for sun, sol, sole, is masculine. Why? Who knows? Someone thousands of years ago said sun, masculine. The word for table is feminine. I don't know why. Could just as easily be masculine, right? And so when you talk about gender, you've already opened the door to the 32 flavors or whatever it is now that you have, okay? And so we have to be careful. We don't say, what gender is someone? No, it's what sex are you? And a year ago, when Obama came out with that totally absurd decree about gender inclusive bathrooms in the public schools, it was the end of the semester, and it's in this public college where I do some teaching. And it was the last couple of weeks of the semester. It was a philosophy class. And I began the class the next day, and I said, ladies and gentlemen, I said, I have a confession to make. I said, I've been lying to you all semester. I said, the first day of class, I told you that I'm Father Peter Stravinskas, I'm a Catholic priest. You see the way I've been dressing. It's all a lie. It's all an absolute lie. I said, and they're looking, and I said, actually, I'm Napoleon. And I want you to understand that that's who I am, and that you're to address me as Napoleon for the next 2 weeks of the course. Now, some of you are going to say, but Napoleon is buried in Paris in the Hotel des Invalides. I don't want to hear that. I am Napoleon. Now, you're going to go home tonight probably and say, you know, that priest that we thought we had for the class, he's really a nut. Not only does he think he's Napoleon, but he's making us call him Napoleon. And one of the kids said, wow, never heard it explained that way. Got it. Right? And it was just at the time of all the Bruce Jenner nonsense, right? But you see, if you explain it to people who are even partially rational, they see how crazy the whole thing is. And we have to be able and willing to engage the anti-culture. This is all insanity. I mean, if a very dumb sophomore in a state college can see it, right, that we can work with this still. It's not completely lost. This is a relatively new book by Ryan Topping. I think he teaches at presently at either Thomas More or Northeast Catholic College in New England. The Case for Catholic Education: Why Parents, Teachers, and Politicians Should Reclaim the Principles of Catholic Pedagogy. So we do have our own form of teaching, and it's based on the classical model. So the crisis of Catholic education, a history with a lesson. Where did we start to get off track? When we became, now this is the 50th anniversary of that horrible Land of Lakes document, which set Catholic higher education on its tail. But it was what? We started doing navel gazing and were, quote, intimidated by the wonderful secular schools. They're not wonderful, they never were, okay? And so we have something that's unique, and we need to be confident about it. The schools and our children, no passing grade. The purposes of education: happiness, culture, and virtue. Notice it's not about getting a job, right? It's not about making money. And it's interesting, Socrates says, people who look for knowledge to gain money will never gain virtue. He said, but people who gain knowledge to gain virtue also very often will get money later, right? And what's the purpose of education for the average American parent? Johnny's got to be in the right preschool, and now preschool starts about 6 minutes after birth, right? And because we just want a babysitting service, that's all about. So he's got to be in the right preschool, so he gets into the right kindergarten, so he gets into the right elementary school, so that he gets into the right junior high, so he gets into the right high school, he gets into the right college, so he gets into the right graduate program in order to make money. That's all. Nothing to do with knowledge. I mentioned to someone the other day that a mother came up to me one time, very upset. Her daughter got a D in English. And I said, I'm glad you're upset. That's good. I said, but I need to ask you why you're upset. Are you upset that your daughter got a D because she doesn't know English? Or are you upset that she got a D whether or not she knows English? I said, so if she had gotten an A and still didn't know English, would you be here today? And she said, you're outrageous. Of course, we know what the answer is. She wouldn't have been there at all. My daughter got A's. She was brilliant, okay? And of course, it's the dumbing down of things. In New York City, they now are talking about how the achievement levels of the kids are just rising exponentially. Why? Because they kept lowering the standard, right? They kept making it lower and lower, so now more and more are passing. At the, I was telling Bishop Arthur last night at this college, one of the deans, we've had 3 of them in 5 years, one worse than the next, but one of them said to me, well, how do you view your presence here? What's your goal? And I said, to convince as many of these kids as possible that they don't belong in college. And she started to laugh. And she said, oh, no, I'm serious, she said. I said, and I am too. I said, these kids, 90% of them don't belong in college because 90% of them don't even belong having a high school diploma. And she said, I can't believe you just said that. Right? And then the president of the college told me that that college has the highest graduation rate moving into four-year colleges of any community college in the state of New Jersey. I said, so? Well, he said, isn't that wonderful? I said, not really. I said, if they don't know anything, they don't belong moving on. I said, it could be that the other state colleges have higher standards, which I'm sure they don't anyway. But so the whole thing about virtue and happiness. The methods of the teacher. Imitation before invention. So, you know, Paul's whole thing. Imitate me as I have imitated Christ. The matter of learning, the sprightly 7 arts. Mary kind of talked about that in terms of the classical curriculum yesterday. The coming renewal, faith in the future. And he has discussion questions and guides for further study. It's a teensy little book, but very, very well worth it. Produced by, I think, Angelico Press, which is one of the newer presses. Renewing the Mind by the same author, a reader in the philosophy of Catholic education. Wonderful, wonderful book. And it's excerpts from all kinds of classical authors on, so Plato, Aristotle, Quintilian, Augustine, Aquinas, Newman, John Paul, Basil the Great, Bonaventure, Maritain. It's just a wonderful, wonderful anthology. And then Laura Berquist, this is from Ignatius Press, Designing Your Own Classical Curriculum. Now this is for homeschoolers, and you already got my take on that. But the whole idea, we talk about classical education. There's no one particular model of it. There are variations on the theme. And it's sometimes, there was a priest who was in our seminar last year who went back and decided he was going to adapt or motivate his faculty and administrator to adopt a classical mode of education. And one of the first pushbacks he got, was a very blue-collar area, people said, you know, our kids aren't going to Harvard, you know, and we just want them to be able to read and write and go to Mass on Sunday. And so I said, well, you know, don't use language that people are going to have a bad association with. Just talk about, you know, a traditional Catholic curriculum. Now, there's nothing wrong with preparing blue-collar kids for Harvard even, all right? But don't do things that are going to turn people off. Number one. Number two, that you need to know there are many, many modes of classical education. But she has a good 3rd grade curriculum, 4th grade, and so forth, and all the way through the 12th grade. Now here is the classic by Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind. And when I taught in the Graduate School of Ed here, this was a required text in my philosophy of education course. And Bloom begins this by saying, and he was at Harvard at the time, he said, the one thing that every college professor can be assured of before any kid opens his mouth is that the students that he's involved with are moral relativists, right? And that's long before Benedict was on the scene. Now, the irony is that Bloom himself is a moral relativist, all right? So, but perhaps he knows what he's talking about from personal experience. But It's an excellent analysis of the situation in '87. So you can imagine, I mean, in fact, it's calm compared to where we are now. So students, the clean slate, they know nothing, okay? The books they read, the music they listen to, and the relationships that they have. And God bless him. And he talks about relationships, self-centeredness, right? It's all about me, okay? Separateness. And again, this is before internet, it's before social media. But I've watched this with college kids. 20 years ago, before class, kids would be chatting with each other before class began. You had to say, okay, calm down, let's get started. You don't have to say that anymore. They don't talk to each other, right? We're all texting. The real lunacy, a woman told me, a woman in her 40s, that she gets together with some of her quote girlfriends once a month for lunch, all in their late 30s, early 40s. And last summer she called me up, she said, Father, I had the most bizarre lunch today of my life. I said, what? She said, I was there with my 8 girlfriends, and we didn't talk to each other at all. I said, 8 women didn't talk for a 2-hour lunch. She said, no, we all, want to finish the sentence? Texted each other. Isn't that salad dressing fab? Did you ever have such a great Chardonnay? This is lunacy, right? But it's separateness. I mean, ironically, social media is supposed to connect us, and what has it done? Isolated. And he talks about divorce, race, love, eros, sex, right? He's got the analysis, it's perfect. And then he talks about the university, Heidegger and the Enlightenment and all the rest of it. It's all here. And it's just good to, and as I say, at a distance of 30 years, you can see. Here is one of the volumes of that textbook series that Mary Pat and I were talking about yesterday, All Ye Lands, World Cultures and Geography. And what grade is this for? This is volume 6 of the series. And Introduction to Geography. And there was a linguistic mistake that was made that led to a pedagogical mistake. When some of us were kids, we had 2 courses, geography and history. And then somewhere, I guess in the 60s, they decided to merge the 2 into social studies. And now kids know neither geography nor history, right? And so Introduction to Geography, Prehistory, Beginning Man's Story, The Mission of Israel, The Marvelous Greeks, Eternal Rome, Christianity, catch this, A Gift from God, right? Byzantium and the Rise of Islam, Religion of Peace, Europe, the Middle Ages, Europe, the Renaissance and its consequences, China, the Middle Kingdom, Japan, Land of the Rising Sun, India, World of the Rajas, Africa, the Enduring Continent, Russia, the Third Rome, North America, Land of Opportunity, Latin America, the Sleeping Giant. And just look at the artwork. And for the teacher's guide, it gives information about the artwork, but also gives links to music from the same period. So it's a completely holistic approach to history. So if you're studying the Renaissance in Western Europe, you're introducing the kids to the art of the period and also the music of the period, which of course is the way it ought to be happening. Right? This comes from Gracewing Publishers, which is in England, a companion to Catholic education. And it's about 15 authors. And let's see, what are the topics here? God and Philosophy, Scripture, Christology, Understanding the Church Today, Active Participation in the Liturgy. Active does not mean kinetic, just moving constantly, right? One participates actually. Sacraments, a rationale for Catholic schools, contemporary approaches to religious education, exploring theology through art, anyone who's local ought to be taking kids to the Cloisters Museum, once a year with an introduction to. Every time I go there, I'll bring some guests out of towners, and I never can get through the museum without being stopped a half dozen times by visitors saying, "Father, could you explain that? What's that piece of artwork?" Well, it's catechetical, all right? And that's another reason why the art in a Catholic school ought to be classical religious art, not silly, ugly things, all right? So that you're introducing the doctrines being taught through the medium of the beautiful, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Most people don't get attracted to the good immediately, huh? Or the true. It's the beautiful that's the first avenue to bring them into the other two. I knew a fellow at Princeton University who was dating a Catholic girl. He grew up in a sort of agnostic mode. He was an architecture major at Princeton, and coming from a very yuppie family on Long Island, when he graduated from Princeton, the parents thought he needed a 3-month vacation in Europe, and because he had worked so hard for 4 years at Princeton. And so Jack went to Europe, and when he came back, he called me and he said, "Father, I want to become a Catholic." As I said, he'd already been dating a Catholic girl, and eventually they married. I witnessed the marriage. But I said, "Well, what did this?" And he said, "Any religion that can produce such beauty has to be the true religion." And it was the art and the architecture that was the source of evangelization for him. And then the last chapter, contributing to the pastoral spiritual life of the Catholic school. The parish school, American Catholic parochial education from colonial times to the present. The picture on the front is priceless. It looks like my 3rd grade picture. And that's an historical analysis. And then there's a book from Oxford University Press called Teaching the Tradition, Catholic Themes in Academic Disciplines, by Father John Pitterick. You know him, I guess. He used to be at Fordham. Now he's the Vicar General for the Archdiocese of San Francisco. And his sidekick, who's Melanie Maury. And they engaged a number of scholars to write reflections on the various academic disciplines and how they can be integrated with faith. And so the Catholic intellectual tradition in the humanities, religious themes related to the sciences, the good life in the professions, economics, education, medicine, and law. Just an invaluable work. And granted, that's for how to do it at the university level, but mutatis mutandis, that means we can do it at lower levels as well. Oh, and these are the books that go with that theology of the body. And I mentioned to you, I think the first evening, Samuel Blumenfeld, is Public Education Necessary. And here is his conclusion. The failure of public education is the failure of statism as a political philosophy. It has been tried, it has been found solely wanting. Having learned from our mistakes, would it not be better to return to the basic principles upon which this nation was founded? The point he's making historically is there were no public schools in this country until the end of the 19th century. All schools were private schools, all were denominational schools. Education was not seen then as a cure-all for mankind's moral diseases, but it was on that premise that the reformers built the present system, John Dewey and Company. They were wrong. The system cannot work because in a free society, government has no more place in education than it has in religion. Once Americans grasp the full significance of this idea, they will understand why the return of educational freedom is essential to the preservation and expansion of American freedom in general. And then Vincent Ruggiero, warning, nonsense is destroying America. The role of popular culture in America's social problems. The Bishop and I were watching just the news last night, and we were doubled over in laughter with one scenario after another of ridiculous looking people saying stupid things, the way they look, the way they dress, and that's where we are. Right? You look at, I love, if I sit on the subway in Manhattan and just look at the people. I mean, first of all, the glazed over look. There's no life, there's no reality, nothing behind it, it's all empty. And then the obnoxious behavior that goes with it. So, you know, a couple of months ago, that woman who had the temerity to say to another woman on the train, "Would you please move your bag so I can sit down?" And she beat the hell out of her. I mean, first of all, you're simply asking for what's your right, and the reaction is outrageous. So, but again, that's the cultural phenomenon, huh? And where is it fostered? In the music, in the film, in relationships, the whole business. So, questions, comments? That's the end of show and tell. There she is. Good morning. Welcome. We're just a little bit behind.
That's fine. I'll just sit here and be quiet.
So, any other observations? Just make sure all of those items return. Sister, you have a comment?
I think you are well read.
Well, it's a lifetime of doing it, so it's not that at our house we have about 5,000 books. When Dr. Gillette came for dinner one evening, we brought her through the library. Oh. It also helps to be editor of a magazine. You get all kinds of books free. So, any comments about any of the books in particular, or questions about them, or the videos?
I'd like to add an additional resource. This would have to do with both science and culture, and it comes from the Institute of Science and Religion at Oxford University.
Is that Anselm?
No, I'm trying to remember his name. He's a priest from the Archdiocese of Orlando, right? I can't remember his name at the moment. And he's written, he and another fellow have written these little books. They're like pocket books, and they have 3 of them, 4 of them, and they're basically on. They would be very good for high school students on precisely those kinds of things you've been talking about, on the contributions of Catholics to the natural science, the social sciences, and so on and so forth, and then the interrelationship of the way in which these translate into influence within the framework of the larger culture.
There's a sister in Baltic, Connecticut, the Sisters of Charity of Mary, Mother of the Church, and they run, at their mother house, they run a girls' academy, a Holy Family Academy, and Sister Mark, another brilliant woman, she has graduate degrees in theology, English, and science. And when she teaches science, she has this long vertical chart that has the name of every Catholic scientist in history and the contribution. And so the minute a girl walks through the door of that classroom, the first thing she realizes is there's no historical conflict between the church and science. This is what it is. They tell a wonderful story about Pasteur, who was an extremely devout man, went to Mass every day. And he was on a train from Paris to Lourdes, and he's there praying the rosary on the train, and some very up-and-coming would-be scholar obnoxiously went up to him and said, "Sir, get rid of that. Get rid of that. This is the age of science." And Pasteur just kept praying the rosary. And the guy was badgering him the whole time. And finally, as Pasteur got off the train, he went and gave his card and said, Louis Pasteur, scientist, Sorbonne. And that was sort of the end of the conversation, obviously. But I think, we've said this numerous times, the first logjam that we have to break is getting out of people's minds, particularly young people, that there's a conflict between science and religion, because that just knocks out the relationship immediately. All right, we'll take, say, a 10-minute break and then come back because we have our next speaker that will dazzle you. So.